Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the RFT-CBS framework focused on the overarching goals of psychotherapy. So this tutorial is adapted from the second part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. You can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. In this tutorial, you will learn about the second overarching goal of therapy, functional coherence. So just to remind you of where we were at in the exploration of our clinical framework in the previous tutorial, so we talked about flexible context sensitivity, which can be defined as the capacity to notice various features of the context and to respond to what is most relevant. It's a bit like looking carefully at pieces of a jigsaw in order to find out what pieces fit together. And making things fit together actually corresponds to our second overarching goal, which is functional coherence. And that's what we're going to talk about in this tutorial. So let's first explain what we mean by coherence. We've already come across this concept when we talked about the ways language can lead to psychological problems. Coherence is a core property of language and cognition, which consists of establishing symbolic relations sufficiently consistent with each other within the same network to allow for mutual and combinatorial entailment to occur. Okay, it's a little bit of a geeky definition, but in simpler terms, it means that we need to build symbolic relations in a consistent way in order to use language as a communication and influence tool. It begins with the simple act of naming things and deriving mutual relationships between names and objects. Deriving a mutual relation is the most basic form of coherence. Then it becomes more complex with the involvement of multiple relations that need to be integrated into coherent networks. When we ask ourselves existential questions, for example, we try to make all experiences fit together into a network that makes sense. And if something doesn't fit, it seems that all the meaning is threatened, as it sometimes happens when we lose someone we love, or when we are victim of a traumatic experience. So one thing that is important to understand is that coherence is not a side effect of language, but a core property of language. There is no language without coherence. But coherence can be found in many ways. First, there are different types of coherence. We mentioned before essential and social coherence, which often leads to psychological problems, and functional coherence, which helps orient our actions in more pragmatic ways. But even inside these types of coherence, there are many ways of building networks that make sense. For example, we can find meaning in our lives in different ways. Some will find it through their roles as parents, others by being in harmony with nature, others through religion, and so on. We are always building jigsaws, but we don't build the same jigsaw. The reason why we're interested in this process of coherence is because the way we make sense of our experiences influences how we respond to them. Metaphorically, we could say that depending on what jigsaw we are building, we won't pick the same pieces or arrange them together the same way. So let's take an example to understand this idea in a clinical context. We'll take the example we used in our section on flexible context sensitivity and look at it from the perspective of coherence. We saw in the last tutorial that this woman wants to give a lecture in front of a large audience. And one of the things she noticed was her fast heartbeat. That was one element of her context. Now, this piece of context, this experience, can be conceptualized in different ways. The woman might think that it's the sign she is not prepared and that she should cancel the talk. Or she could see this fast heartbeat as a sign that she cares about teaching and decide that she will give this lecture. It's the same original experience, or the same piece of jigsaw, but two different ways of integrating it into symbolic networks. Or said simply, two different ways of interpreting it. Depending on the path she follows, she will likely end up in two different directions. Either she gives the talk, or she leaves. So what we want to do in therapy is help clients conceptualize their experiences and responses in ways that are useful, pragmatic. In other words, we want to shape a functional kind of coherence. If this woman cares about teaching, in this very moment, it's probably more useful to connect her fast heartbeats to this meaningful purpose and to choose to stay than to leave because she thinks she's not prepared. Note that having the thought, I am not prepared, I will cancel, is not a problem per se. She could have these thoughts and still give the talk. But in order to do that, she needs to connect this situation to what she cares about, or at least to some other sources of influence that are more likely to take her in this direction. She might also conceptualize the thought, I am not prepared, I will cancel, as just a thought, which she doesn't have to obey. Doing that is a form of functional coherence applied to the thought itself. So, as we did for flexible context sensitivity, let's look at some examples of therapeutic techniques that help shape functional coherence. One typical technique of ACT is to encourage clients to discriminate their actions as moves toward or away from their values. At each moment, the client can sort her choices according to these two categories, which help her be in touch with the effectiveness of her actions. If you do that with a visual tool, like the choice points I put here, it increases the impact that this way of thinking can have on the client's responses. It's like a metaphor. It's very concrete, so it's easy to observe and remember. Another way of shaping functional coherence is to use techniques that lead clients to take a different perspective and conceptualize their experiences as things they have rather than things they are. For example, there are lots of techniques in mindfulness-based therapies that consist of having clients reformulate their thoughts by saying, I have the thoughts that, or by imagining their thoughts as clouds in the sky, or by noticing that they are noticing. All these techniques can help clients build networks about their experiences that decrease the impact of these experiences. It's a form of distancing that is supported by language. In contrast to what we often hear, these techniques are not outside of language, but rooted in language. However, they help be more flexible with language and stay in touch with what works. Another technique that shapes functional coherence is the exploration of pros and cons of changing in motivational interviewing. The client is led to consider the consequences of either choice, which helps him see what is best for him. And more generally speaking, functional coherence can be shaped through informal conversations about the effectiveness of clients' responses. Each time you ask a client whether what they did worked, it's a contribution to the shaping of a pragmatic way of thinking. Remember that in our framework, thinking is a clinically relevant behavior, and functional coherence is a broad class of behavior which we want clients to be skilled at because it will help them build and sustain a meaningful life. And as we said for flexible context sensitivity, shaping functional coherence needs to be done in accordance with the general RFT-CBS principles applied to psychotherapy. First, functional coherence is a behavior, and so it needs to be shaped through alteration of the context. You can't just force clients to think pragmatically, you need to create a context that helps them think pragmatically. For example, asking the question, is it working? Can create this kind of context. We need to follow a cumulative and integrative approach, which means that even when clients don't think functionally, these thoughts can't be suppressed. They need to be integrated into larger networks that are more functional. In our example of the woman giving a lecture, I said that she could integrate her thought that she's not prepared and needs to cancel the talk into a broader thought stating that this is just a thought and that given that she cares about teaching, she will stay and give the talk instead. It's a yes and approach, which orients the client to more useful choices. So obviously, shaping functional coherence is consistent with the general recommendation of encouraging functional coherence over essential and social coherence. However, it's worth paying attention to the way we shape functional coherence. For example, it's tempting for therapists to use their social influence to convince clients that the best way of thinking is the pragmatic way, or to send the message that pragmatism is the one and only right way to think. But if we do that, yes, we shape functional thinking to some extent, but the way we do it is in contradiction with our message, so it can impair the learning process. So in general, we prefer encouraging clients to consider if thinking pragmatically is what is useful to them. That's why ACT therapists, for example, often watch for clients saying, I should move toward my values. In a sense, yes, it's good to move toward our values, but we want to maintain some flexibility even in this area. Finally, we want to shape functional coherence through experiential means. It means that rather than teaching clients didactically about pragmatism, we encourage them to observe the contingencies influencing their behaviors. Asking questions about antecedents and consequences is a good way of shaping functional coherence experientially, for example. This overarching goal of therapy can be summarized by Einstein's quote saying that we can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. In other words, we need to think differently to have different outcomes. And what we suggest in CBS RFT is to think functionally. Here's a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I encourage you to remember. The coherence is a core property of language and cognition. The way we make sense of our experiences influences how we respond to them. Functional coherence is a way of thinking that is primarily guided by the impact that our ideas have on our experience. It's an overarching goal of therapy. Functional coherence needs to be shaped in accordance with what we know about language and cognition from an RFT perspective. This is the end of this tutorial on the CBS RFT framework focused on functional coherence as the second overarching goal of therapy. So this tutorial was adapted from the second part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch the next tutorial on the RFT-CBS framework focused on the overarching strategy of psychotherapy, you can go to languageasintervention.com. You will also find other resources on the applications of RFT for clinical practice.